The tension between an individual's rights and a group's rights gets further aggravated when the human person fighting for her rights belongs to a historically, socially, economically, and demographically marginalized community. A judiciary peopled with individuals who are trapped in the vice-like grip of the oppressive categories of caste, class, gender, exclusivist religion, sexuality, and so on, unwittingly become a prey to the very pathologies that it is entrusted to battle and keep at bay. The rights discourse in the modern political thought is essentially a discourse of empowerment of marginalized groups, aiming as it does to put embargo on religious and quasi-religious sanctions and specific cultural perspectives, eliminate institutional patronage, and facilitate bonding and solidarity. However, what we see every now and then is that these coercive oppressive categories rear their heads and sneak into the jurisprudence and legal judgments when no one is watching. Since the present paper focuses on the category of caste and its negotiation in Gujarati Dalit literature, I will confine my discussion to the examples of legal discourse surrounding caste in India. In March 2018, as a reaction to what it termed, I quote, clear abuse of process of court, and once again I quote, to avoid false implication of an innocent under Anti-Atrocities Act, the Supreme Court of India issued astounding orders that threatened to substantially dilute the safeguards in the SC/ST Act of 1989. Amongst several damning edicts, the court, first of all, allowed anticipatory bail for those accused of committing atrocities, and secondly, subjected the arrest of an accused public servant as well as a non-public servant to approval of appointing authority or SSP of the area respectively. What is interesting here is that the apex court considered the safeguard against a crime more coercive than the crime itself and regarded its apparent coerciveness as a justification for weakening the safeguard and giving a free rein to the crime. In another instance of legal positivist myopia, the courts refused to invoke the Atrocities Act while penalizing the accused of the infamous Kerlanji massacre, which has come to assume symbolic value in the bloody history of caste violence and injustice. If I'm not mistaken, the appeal of Bhaiyalal, who lost his wife, young daughter and 2 sons to horrifying caste violence in Kerlanji, is still pending in the apex court 3 years after his death by heart attack. This paradox at the heart of judicial understanding and treatment of caste is cogently explained by Mark Gallanter in his seminal essay, Law and Caste in Modern India. Gallanter says, though caste as purveyor of ritual rank and pollution has been banished from Indian law, the legal notion of caste has been reinscribed as groups distinguished by certain economic, educational, and social characteristics. I quote, thus the courts present an alternative image or images of the caste group, not images of occupational interdependence with a network of local groups or of ritual standing in an ideal all-India system of ceremonial ranks, but images in terms of economic, educational, and political attainments and of sectarian or cultural distinctiveness, unquote. In a tongue-in-cheek phraseology, Gallanter ends his essay by saying, while the pre-independence law represented Sanskritization in legal notions of caste, the post-independence law, far from speaking of abolition of caste, represents westernization of notions of caste. One may agree or disagree with Gallanter here, but what one can't disagree with is the fact that the caste bias frequently makes a muted appearance in legal discourse and imposes disabilities on a large population under the garb of positivist language, thus decentering the law and the judiciary from their core functions of dispensing justice and protecting human rights and dignity. These two examples also serve to bring out the fundamental tug of war in Indian society between tradition and modernity, collectivity and individual, and universal good and human rights. Look closely the invocation of the coercive and abusive aspects of Anti-Atrocities Act, or transcoding a caste-based crime into a routine land dispute or personal vengeance are indicative of the failure of the modern republic and law to produce robust ethical political community, peopled with enlightened citizenry, whose moral stamina and sense of humanity would obviate the very need for positive discrimination or a slew of coercive legislations. My contention is that the judiciary which resorts to the positivist language and the society which finds the law coercive do not have access to the language of everyday social. Now, here, while invoking this term everyday social, I am drawing on the theoretical insights provided by Gopal Guru in his latest book, probably, which came out in 2019, titled Experience, Caste, and Everyday Social. So, I'm saying that the judiciary and the society does not have an access to the language of the everyday social that focuses on the particular experience of caste from the point of view of the Dalits. The vibrant social unfolding in the Dalit narratives of pain and suffering is animated not only with rawness of experience, but it's constituted by the sensory, the smell, the sound, the taste, and the touch, which are peculiar to the Dalit social. Such distinctive sensorium of the caste social, when undergirded with a language of rights and arched over by a moral universe, becomes deeply implicated in human rationality and brings about a fundamental change in the worldview of the readers. As a caveat, let me underscore the ontological impossibility of understanding the suffering of the other, or the impossibility of experiencing their experiential social. However, I tend to concur with Sudipto Kaviraj when he says that of all domains of scholarly inquiry, only literature has imaginative capability to give a language-mediated word picture of the experience of caste. This is the reason why Dalit literature, as also other literatures written by the marginalized, should be a compulsory reading in the classrooms, more specifically in spaces engaging with legal studies and research. The language of rights, as well as exposure to the experiential social one encounters in the Dalit literature, goes a long way in dismantling the positivist stranglehold and humanizing the jurisprudence. For example, a short story by Gujarati Dalit writer Dalpat Chauhan, titled The Invasion, would not only drive students to investigate how asymmetrical has been the implementation of land reforms in Gujarat and how Dalits have not been able to claim ownership of land already allocated to them. But the story would yield insight into something more fundamental, something more visceral, that is, the relationship between land and labor. In the story, the Dalit protagonist, Natho, has a secured possession of a shred of the government wasteland, but the village prevents him from cultivating it for 3 years by challenging his legal ownership of the shred. The story begins by Natho daydreaming about the time when his waist-high crop of pearl millet will be ready for harvesting. He envisages streams of sweat rolling down his body and disappearing into his land, into the soil. Such closely material as well as intensely affective relationship between Dalit labor and land represents an authenticity which is absent in the corporates or a state's claim on the land. The grammar of the act of drinking pesticides by a Dalit couple in Guna, Madhya Pradesh last year, when revenue officials bulldoze their crop in public land, becomes understandable only when one is familiar with the quality of this relationship, the relationship the Dalit has with the land. Another story titled Fear captured the moments of heroic resistance put up by spirited Dalit youths against sexual exploitation of Dalit women by feudal overlords in 1975 in Golana, a village that turned into a theater of macabre after 11 years in what is now infamous as Golana massacre. It becomes a historical document recording traditional rights of the Kshatriya men over bodies of every single Dalit woman in the village. In deference to the custom, the husband of the Dalit woman had to walk out of the house when a Kshatriya entered it. The story, which depicts the inner turmoil and anguish of the lunatic son of one such woman, puts forward a necessary counterfactual to the grounds on which the rapists of PLENARY in 1992 were acquitted by the district court in 1995. It's very interesting to know what were the grounds on which the acquittal was done. The first ground was Devi was raped in the presence of her husband, and the judges said that no husband in India would stay silent and watch passively the rape of his own wife in front of his own eyes. And the second ground was that the rapist comprised a middle-aged uncle and his nephew, a young nephew. So the judges recorded that in the Indian family system, no uncle and nephew together would rape a woman, a Dalit woman. One can go on and on with the matchmaking of legal factuals and the literary counterfactuals. However, I would like to end by underlining an important aspect related to visibility of caste in literary as well as public spheres. Within the discourses of anti-colonial nationalism and post-colonial national modernity, the articulation of caste and caste relations in public sphere came to be regarded as illegitimate and pre-modern respectively. In the urban, modern, secular spaces, there are movements by groups with vested interest, of course, claiming that caste does not exist in modern India. Similarly, in the domains of mainstream literary and cultural production, caste always makes a muted appearance. Even when caste is invoked, it is transcoded as something else. M.S.S. Pandian's essay, One Step Outside Modernity, makes a convincing investigation of this societal myopia towards the caste. To tell you briefly what is his argument, Pandian effectively examines the autobiographies written by the upper caste people and the autobiographies of the Dalits. And he examines specifically the autobiography of R.K. Narayan. And he says that throughout the autobiography, Narayan does not reveal his caste identity, that he is a Brahmin himself. But caste makes a muted appearance in the autobiography when Narayan talks about his servants' quarters and the life that the servants lead. And he says that the servants in our house are allowed to cook meat in their quarters, and we could know that they were cooking meat because the smell of the meat would come floating to the main house. So on the other hand, Pandian says that the Dalit autobiographies brings caste to the center stage, and caste is held as a category in relation to which they they conjure up their own self-identity. So to annihilate caste, it is imperative to make its noxious spread visible to the unseeing eyes. Not only eyes, but the whole human sensorium has to be sensitized to the everyday social of caste so as to evolve the ethical community with a deep sense of rights, justice, and human dignity, which will eventually render laws irrelevant. And the only space from where such community can emerge is a space of a classroom, a space of hope for the discovery of a just jurisprudence. Thank you. Dr. Ramanathan, you are on mute, I think. You are still on mute.
Professor Hema Ramanathan.
Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
Yeah.
Sorry, it took a little while for it to unmute itself. That was a really sensitive rendering of many issues of the Dalits, and very interesting, very, very interesting. And I think it brings to the fore why people need to read more authentic material. Like you said, not material written by the upper class about the Dalits, but writing by the Dalits themselves, which moves us to the next speaker. Professor K. Sunita Rani is from the Center for Women's Studies, University of Hyderabad. And she brings in her life to writing about Australian Aboriginal women, about Sri Lankan women, and now about the Dalits. And her talk is titled About the Banned Stories, Revisiting Ismat Chugtai's The Lihaaf Trial. So, Professor Suneetha Rani.
The chair, co-panelists, colleagues, and students, a very good evening to all of you. I must begin by thanking the organizers for thinking of me to be part of this panel discussion. I'm trying to minimize this. The technical hitches. Ismat Chugtai is one of the very, very well-known writers, a woman writer, a Muslim woman writer, probably the first Muslim woman writer in pre-independence India to hint at, to talk about the same-sex love. And she is one of the women writers who has been extensively discussed, critiqued, especially for her work, the short story called The Lihaaf. And The Lihaaf it did not, of course, it moved people, it actually provoked people to discuss, but it also took her to the court of law. So there is also a narrative that comes out from her, which is related to the legalities, legal procedures, and the court. The series of articles on Ismat Chugtai's Lihaaf and the Lihaaf trial that I came across made me think about some more dimensions that can be explored, particularly related to the Lihaaf trial. People have written about the way she was dragged to the court and how the obscenity issue became a major problem and how her identity also became a problem, how the British government could not tolerate women's articulation, different points, including looking at her presence in the court as the sexual subaltern in the court. So there are various ways of reading the Lihaaf trial particularly, but I have chosen to read it not radically away from the existing readings, but I want to look at the way she represents jail and court, and how these places, not just as spaces and places, not just as buildings and representatives of official power, but also as memories of Ismat Chugtai's life at various points, and how she constantly compares home, court, and jail, and how there is like simultaneously on one hand she is refusing to take the summons from the court, and in the same breath she is like eager to visit the jail, and in the same breath again she is excited to appear before the court. So the contradictions, the contrast in her voice, in her stand, and the tone that she uses, a very humorous, a very sarcastic tone that she uses, I argue in this paper that all these are forms of her resistance, forms of her assertion. Even where the law is ruling, she is able to bring out her voice and not so much overtly question law, but she's trying to constantly prove that I'm not afraid of law. And if you have banned my voice, if you have banned my work, there are other ways of speaking as well. Well, let me come to reading of the paper. My paper is not a very lengthy paper, but it's going to be short. The band voices revisiting Ismat Chugtai's The Lihaaf trial. Voices get forbidden, censored, and silenced for different reasons in different times and in different contexts. While the social and cultural agencies censor and silence some voices, the state too enforces its power officially, legally, banning some voices. The voices against the state ideology or governmental authority always irritate the rulers so much that they decide to criminalize such voices. The brave new worlds are often subjected to restrictions and limitations. When it comes to women's writing, there are multiple factors that decide and dictate what and how women's expression should be. The guarded tongue, as it is described, is always aware of this, not just aware, but conscious of the surveillance, and sometimes it ends up giving explanations even unasked for. The censorship here is not exercised only by the state, but by the social and cultural forces as well. Most often, women's texts are followed by supplementary texts, which are a kind of clarification, an explanation on why they wrote in a certain manner and what followed their writing a text. Such postscripts also become very useful tools to read women's texts. While we are aware of the fact that any text will have multiple texts layered in them, accessible or inaccessible to the readers depending on their location and the writer's intention to share and not to share with the readers. One such postscript is written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, an American woman writer who was writing towards the end of 19th century. Her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, in fact, the long short story, the well-known long short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was published in the New England magazine in 1891. A physician wrote in another journal, in another newspaper, the transcript that such a story ought not have been written as it is capable of driving anyone mad. And in response to that, Charlotte Perkins Gilman writes, "Why I wrote the yellow wallpaper." It's almost like an explanation. It's almost like explaining herself and also giving a clarification that I'm not going to drive anybody mad. My story is not going to drive anyone mad. I quote, "It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked," unquote. She refers to a home jail in her story. And in her postscript, to which she was subjected as she fell ill post childbirth, she was not allowed to think, not allowed to speak, not allowed to write, or not allowed to take up any activity. It is this stagnation of mind and body with no interaction with the outside world that turns her house, that single room apartment that she is located, in fact, she's relocated in, which turns into a prison. And 24 hours of the day, she thinks of escaping from that prison. And it is this postscript that I would like to use as a tool to analyze Ismat Chugtai's Lihaaf trial that I have chosen to. They are very different. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is in fact getting sucked into the world of depression post childbirth, while Ismat Chugtai is actually facing the obstacles with a smile. She's writing about it in a very humorous manner, but both are very closely related in the sense both are not separated by a long time. The difference between the two, the gap between the two is just a few decades. And both are writing like from a colony, in a sense, America, which had come out of the colonial forces a few decades ago, and India, which was still grappling with the colonial context, where the Victorian morality was still ruling and dictating, particularly women writers. And the images of home and jail, like that, they shift between, particularly Charlotte Perkins Gilman, her shifting between jail and home, and thinking about childbirth, the child, yeah, and the way the thinking woman in her was simply smothered, was simply hushed up post childbirth. Ishmael Chugtai is also talking about post childbirth. And in fact, while Charlotte Perkins Gilman doesn't have a child in her hands, doesn't have a milk bottle in her hand, doesn't stay in her original home, everything opposite to this happens with Ishmael Chugtai. She is at her home, she is holding the baby, she is holding the milk bottle, and then she is trying to show how she doesn't hesitate to put these things away, to see the prison and to voice her concerns in the court of law. So, however, I continue with my reading. However, there is another woman writing from a different context, with a different identity in different times, but about the court and the prison that her writing has taken her to. I propose to examine the description of the court and the jail by Ishmael Chugtai as a reversal of the state power that subjects voices like Ishmat Chugtai to censorship. I argue that Ishmat Chugtai's humorous and sarcastic descriptions of the jail and the court are also a form of resistance that she employs. Ishmat Chugtai, in her The Lihaaf trial, portrays herself as a homebound nursing mother who is longing to enter the court, particularly to get the imprisonment as punishment, which she doesn't get, of course. And I think that is also one reason why she looks back at that entire experience and she says, I was longing to stay in the jail, in the prison. Can we understand it? Can we interpret it as if she was commenting on the domesticity as well as one prison that she was longing to look at the other prison as well? The summons from the court that she receives says that Ishmat Chugtai versus the crown. Ishmat Chugtai bursts into laughter looking at the summons rather than being intimidated that she is being put against the all powerful crown. Can we consider it a challenge to the state, which has always tried to exercise authority and control over women's sexuality and free articulation? In fact, in the same text at a later point, she says that she's all praise in a very sarcastic manner for the British government for giving her an opportunity to visit the court, to visit Lahore, to spend some time in Lahore, that too along with Manto, who was also summoned by the court. The postscript is a hit at the notions of obscenity that are held not only by the society and religion, but also by the state. The feminist voices in women's movements in 20th century raised similar questions about the indecent representation of women's act. What is indecent and what is obscene? Why do women's bodies become obscene and indecent? Is it the body that turns into obscene and indecent? Or is it the gaze that turns a body into obscene, into the one that is obscene and indecent? This discussion is taken forward when Manto confronts the lawyer in the same courtroom as to how else he can describe the body of a woman. I'll come to that a little later, but as of now, I would like to concentrate on Ismat Chugtai. There is a contradiction of saying no to summons and longing to visit the jail that is expressed by Ismat Chugtai. She tries to exercise the choice of taking the summons and not taking the summons, and going to the jail or not. I quote, "I will not take it, never. You will be arrested if you don't," Mohsin yelled. "Let them arrest me, but I will not take the summons. You will be thrown in jail." "I will. Can't ask for more. I'm dying to see a jail." "Haven't I asked? Yusuf many times already promised to take me to a jail and show me around. But the wretch always laughs off my request. "Inspector Sahib, please take me to jail. Have you brought any handcuffs?" I asked amiably. Uh, after this, she signs all the required forms, and then she again inquires. She goes to the jail and she asks, "Where are the convicts? I want to see them." And she sees, because she wants to see who are these people who are sharing the space with her and who are like the co-hosts along with her, the co-guests in the prison. And the inspector informs her that they are criminals, not convicts. They'll be presented in the court. And then she asks, out of excitement, what is their crime? What are the crimes that they have committed? Brawling, rioting, pickpocketing, creating a disturbance while drunk. She doesn't find a match at all. She's trying to find a match if there are any other women like her, any other men like her who have revolted, who have used the language and concepts that she has used in her writing, but she doesn't find any match. So she's disappointed, yet she has a hope. Like maybe some dacoits, some murderers would have been an exciting match for her, she thinks. And she also has a very, very valid question to ask, which is again very, very, which is loaded with nuances, that where would you keep me if I'm going to be jailed? Is it here along with them? Where am I going to be jailed? Where are the other women prisoners? I think which has very, very strong connotations of the being with women, the woman bonding, I'm using this term in terms of solidarity. Women coming out of domesticity and raising their voices as part of women's movements as well. But she is answered in a very disappointing manner that there is no provision to keep the women in that prison. Her understanding and visualization of the court as an extension of her home unveils her access to the court not just as part of the proceedings, but as an external gaze that has gained access through her father's position. It is like the backyard for her. Her gaze not only reaches the court building and the court proceedings, but extends to the presence of women in the court. I quote, "When Abba Mia was a judge in Sanihar, the court used to be held next to the men's quarters of the house. We would sit in the window and watch the thieves and dacoits being brought in handcuffed. Once the police captured a band of extremely dangerous dacoits. A ravishingly beautiful woman in breeches and a coat, with the eyes of a hawk, a supple waist, and long black hair accompanied them. She had made a tremendous impression on me." Unquote. Her window becomes her means to look into the court. It is not just her, but she brings in the collective identity of probably the other women of the house as well. Court as an extension of the house, with a window open to the members of the family of the judge, invokes a very powerful image of the court. Some familiarity, but also some unfamiliarity. Changed positions and shifting powers add to this nuanced image of the court. Throughout the postscript, there is a reference to images that relate to home, such as baby, kitchen, family members, milk bottle, etc., etc., as lingering memories of the immediate past as well as her childhood. The court also becomes one of her growing up memories associated with her home, but also associated with her father, whose position gave her an access. Again, which turns the court into a very, very masculine space, a very masculine image, which she's trying to turn it into a kind of a feminine image, feminine visualization, and feminine memory, because herself, her, her women relatives, and the woman who was caught and brought to the court as a convict or as a criminal. What needs to be problematized here, what can be problematized here, is Ismat Chugtai's mental mapping of the domestic slash private and the public slash official as the interconnected childhood memories. This is actually completely in contrast with her description of her experience in the Lahore court. It is not just a comparison of the court as an extension of her childhood home and the present trial at the court that is invoked, but also the image of the woman who Ismat Chugtai says she was with uh, impressed with, that connects Ishmat Chugtai's eagerness to visit the court and go to jail. The ravishingly, I'm quoting, the ravishingly beautiful woman of her childhood memories also adds to the charm of the court in Ishmat Chugtai's imagination. Quickly, I would like to bring in Manjula Padmanabhan's conceptualization of home in one of her short stories, where a house without any windows is seen, and the woman doesn't want anybody to peep into the house, to look into the house, and she doesn't want to look out. So it becomes a very, very closed space. And in fact, what Ishmat Chugtai is talking about is a very open space, but with limited entry, with limited understanding of it. When Ishmat Chugtai actually appears in the court, when she is accused of obscenity, what becomes obscene about her story is that she has written about ashiks, lovers, women collecting ashiks, women collecting lovers. And she's told that this is improper for respectable girls. And then immediately the question is, what about those girls who are not respectable? I think by invoking this conversation in the court, this proceeding particularly in the court, she's also drawing attention to the way women are judged, and particularly women like Ishmat Chugtai were being judged for writing about same-sex love, and also for writing about women, their bodies and sexualities in a very, very explicit manner. And interestingly, it is not the lawyer, it is not the judge that are alleging obscenity. In fact, they seem to be understanding. They seem to be, in fact, countering the case in a sense. But it is the witness, it is the people, it is the readers who have taken this allegation or this case of obscenity against Ishmat Chugtai to the court of law. So once again, we see that court, which is, in fact, she brings as an extension of her childhood memory as a space, as a forum for deliberations, is not hostile to her understanding of the gender question at all. Okay, it seems to be understanding it in a better manner when we compare it with the witness that she is referring to in her the Lihaaf trial. One point I would just want to make, and then maybe I will conclude. I think I'm taking too much of time. Right, the chair, am I taking too long? Yeah, I will quickly conclude. As she's talking about her presence, as she's talking about the gender question, and she's bringing in the space of the court, she's also bringing in a very, very fascinating comparison, that is of Manto and the case against him, and the way he's trying to defend himself. And the others, other poets, other people who are associated with radical writing as well, who are trying to tell her that you cannot write like that. You see, you are a woman. You better think about the limitations on you. We can write about women because we are men and obviously we are interested in women. But you are a woman, you better think about the limitations that you have. Both Manto and Ismat Chugtai were asked to give an apology, and both of them refused to give an apology. By and by, the case was, neither of them was punished as such. But what also strikes me here is, before concluding with an example from the Lihaaf trial, quickly it also brings me to Anupama Rao's work on the caste question, and particularly her book, The Caste and Gender, where she talks about the legal narratives, those legal narratives which are very, very different from the real life incidents, and how these legal narratives are also molded by the powerful people, particularly people from the privileged sections, those who turn the caste related atrocities into narratives of sexual jealousy or sexual atrocities which are not, according to them, not taken that seriously in comparison to the caste related atrocities, because it is also a question of masculinity. It is also the question of singing proudly about the masculinity, preserving the masculinity of the feudal sections. While I'm on this point of masculinity, I must bring in here one more contrast that Ismat Chugtai brings in between her and the police officer who comes to serve the summons on her. I quote, "I stuck the milk bottle out toward the police inspector so that I could free my hand to sign the summons. But he shrank back as if I had pointed the muzzle of a gun at him. Mohsin quickly snatched the bottle from my hand and I signed the paper." Unquote. It is not the woman, Ismat Chugtai, who is afraid of the gun or the punishment that she could be subjected to, but it is the police officer who is afraid of the milk bottle. And this brilliantly sums up her Ismat Chugtai's commentary on institutions, mechanism of control and punishment as the ones that are scared of women and being labeled as feminine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very interesting. To pick up Ismat Chugtai and to look at her in terms not just of gender, but in terms of gender and law and gender of the punishment of women is very important, because we have a lot of discrepancy and discrimination in that, and it's not always against the women. So that was an interesting take on that. So thank you very much. The third speaker is Dr. Manohar Reddy from NALSAR, University of Law, Hyderabad. And he will be talking about rethinking law, language, and literature in India. And that's a question that he asks. It's not a statement that he's making. Dr. Reddy?
Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
I would like to really thank Professor Purvi Pokhrial and Dr. Bini for inviting me to this very important conference. And I'm really glad that I'm here with a very interesting panelist and an eminent scholar who is chairing the session, Professor Ramanathan, who is also, I just Googled up a little bit about her and realized that she has spent a lot of time teaching English and training English teachers. So that makes me a bit nervous because I'm going to talk about the language question in India. And also another thing that probably makes me nervous is when I see 226 people here online, and I quite didn't realize that there are so many people here. Anyway, for just another small thing is Professor Sunitha Rani also. I'm glad that I'm with her on this panel. She was my former colleague at the University of Hyderabad when I taught there before joining NALSAR. For most part of my life, I taught in the English language and literature departments, although I had the opportunity to teach some other interesting courses like cultural studies, critical theory, cinema studies, etc. However, when I joined NALSAR in 2017, I had to reorient myself intellectually in order to make some sense to the law students, because that was the first time I am actually teaching law students. So I at NALSAR basically teach two mandatory courses. One is called Law and Language, and the other one is called Law and Literature. Although I do teach some other seminar courses, which I'm not going to talk about now. I also offered recently a clinic on language and social justice, which involved students going to the courts and sitting and observing the court's proceedings, and also going to the prisons and police stations and interviewing prisoners, also looking at in the language, how people write petitions, etc. So that was quite exciting for me, someone who comes from humanities background and suddenly got myself into this new world. So when I joined here, the NALSAR, first thing I did was I looked at the existing curriculum of law and language, and also talked to the colleagues who had taught this course before, and also tried to look up online for some syllabus that has been being taught at other law schools, and also looked at the Bar Council guidelines, and also tried to understand the history of law and language. One thing I forgot to tell you is I'm going to confine myself in this session only to law and language, and will not go into literature, because I realized that I have around 20 to 25 minutes, so I won't be really able to talk about both law and language and law and literature. So I would confine my discussion to the law and language, not go into the literature. And also I'm deeply interested in this topic, so it makes more sense to confine myself to this. So so when I looked at all this, and I also looked at the Bar Council guidelines, and they are pretty interesting. And I also tried to look up the history of law and language, the way it evolved in the US. So I realized that in India, most universities, the law schools particularly, seem to be teaching the mechanics of legal writing, drafting, interpretation, etc. In the US, there is much more emphasis on the question of interpretation, the questions of ambiguity in writing, politics of reading, writing, and also a lot of discussion happened in relation to something called plain English movement, which many of you might be aware of. So some of these could be found in the Indian context as well, but not to the extent that they figure in the US. However, in the Indian context, I found that the curriculum is entirely English-centric. It's taken for granted that English is the language of the judiciary. Anyone who looks at the syllabus should get this impression immediately almost. Of course, it's true that English is the language of the Supreme Court and the High Courts. But what about the language issues of the lower courts was the first question that I encountered. So how does one really think about that, especially in South India, where predominantly even the lower courts seem to be struggling with this language question. Whereas in the North, I understood that lower courts predominantly use Hindi. But that's not the case in the South. The local languages are not used much. That's true even when I went to some of the district courts here. Both the judge and the lawyer were trying to talk to each other in their own broken English. And it seemed quite pathetic, when you observe how lawyers are trying hard to master this language somehow with very, very few resources, especially the lawyers who have studied in regional medium and somehow managed to get a law degree from a law college and not studied at national law schools. So then I thought, after seeing all this, I thought that law students in national law schools also should understand the language issues that happen in the lower courts. And of course, not just in the judiciary, but try to understand the language situation beyond the judiciary, which I mean that what is happening in the larger education system, what is happening in the administration. So there are many more issues and there are many more sides where language becomes very important in modern life and not just the judiciary. So I thought, therefore, the students must also understand how the language is connected to issues of democracy, popular sovereignty, justice, equality, nationalism, federalism, etc. Now, these are all concepts which probably social sciences students might be taught in universities, but not so much in social science in national law schools, although we have BA LLB in national law schools, but often people forget about the BA part of the BA LLB, and even in the first semester itself, law students assume that they're already lawyers and they don't require to learn much about these kinds of concepts. So therefore, I often remind my students about that part. So therefore, I discuss now what I believe could be taught to the law students in addition to the practical aspects of English language. So I am not really, therefore, offering any solutions. These are only thoughts that I have, and also try to probably making an attempt to understand that language is a much bigger problem than we assume in national law schools. So therefore, this is kind of a warning. If anyone is looking for solutions at the end of the presentation, either the teachers or the students in national law schools, you're not going to get them. So let me now move on to, I have a small PowerPoint presentation. Let me see whether it works. Can you see the screen, please? Okay, I think I need to share the screen.
Sir, you can share screen at the bottom.
I'll just try. Yeah, 1 second. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I've tried to make it full screen. Can you see it full screen?
Yes. Press F5.
Yeah, I've done that.
Sir, please go to slideshow and on the bar at the top, you can see an option slideshow. Please
Yes.
click on that.
Yes.
Then from beginning. The left corner from beginning. Yes.
Yeah. Is it full now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So the question that one needs to understand, therefore, is how is language related to questions like democracy and justice? Now, often we assume that language, in a very narrow sense, in a very positivist linguistics perspective, that language is a tool of communication, and therefore we tend to teach functional English, which is a very typical utilitarian approach, that how is language useful for our day-to-day affairs, like in an office or in a courtroom, etc. Now, on the other hand, if you look at some of the philosophical writings on language, people like Rousseau and Herder, so there are two essays. So the Rousseau talks about how language distinguishes humans from all other species, because language helps us to think, and humans are rational and thinking beings. So of course, we know that this idea of human or the individual as a rational being emerged during the Enlightenment period. Now, Herder also agrees with Rousseau on this particular issue, that language as the specially human trait that distinguishes humanity from all other species. Now, if there are any animal rights activists or lovers, I don't mean to mean anything lower than humans to animals, but I think we must understand that language is not just communication, because we know that animals and flies and birds, they all communicate. But humans, acquire language, whereas animals and birds, etc., it's natural for them. Whatever communication they have, it comes naturally to them. And also, it's everywhere. Like wherever you go, animals have similar kind of communication. Whereas humans speak different languages. Also, we can connect with people who have written, who have recorded their memory thousands of years ago. You can critically reflect on and document histories or produce knowledge and preserve it. All these are not available to humans, animals. So therefore, it's convincing what Herder and Rousseau tell us about the difference between human language and the way animals communicate. So what is interesting also is that from Herder is that language, of course, distinguishes humans from others, but it is also the creator of human differences and diversity of cultures. When he talks about how different languages emerged. So one is both philosophers were concerned with one question is the nature of language itself, human language. The second question that they were interested in, how could so many languages emerge in this world, right? So I will not go into that, because that's the one, if somebody is interested, they could go and read up on that. But what is interesting for this session is that the notion of folk that Herder talks about, and the idea of national community, and the character that language has, which he calls the affect. So we all know that it's not a feeling, but we all know that if you look at history, modern nations emerged in the West based on a linguistic identity. And nation is a community, right? It's an imagined community. Of course, I'll come to that a little later. But we have seen that in modern times, that language has united so many people in so many nations, in so many different ways. So therefore, Herder thinks language not as just a mere tool of communication, but it as the union of souls, as he calls it. So I'll just read out, it's an important paragraph which probably makes better sense than I explain it in my own words. So I quote, "Sometimes it is incomprehensible to me," this is Herder speaking here, "that we seem to so misunderstand the importance of language. We think of it as something that only concerns the grammarian, to see language as the fount of our reason and cooperation, as the tool of instruction for every culture, as the union of sociality and good customs, as the authentic vehicle of the advancement of humanity in every class of humans. This is something of which most of us have only the slightest notion. Language is the union of souls, which binds parents to their children, social orders to one another, the teacher to his pupils, his friends to his fellow citizens, all as human beings." So therefore, this question of language and nationalism is something that in India, in the Indian higher education institutions and classrooms, this discussion doesn't figure much. Therefore, the consequence of that is we have many misconceptions about the role of language in India. So Benedict Anderson, for example, talks about language in his book called The Imagined Communities and Nation as an Imagined Community. So he talks about in the Western context how print capitalism, especially when publishers, when technology was available, printing technology was available to them, they published a lot of books in the vernaculars like French, German, etc. And what was the consequence of that? It's kind of a side effect of this capitalism, print capitalism, was that the emergence of national consciousness, that so many people began to write and read each other, even though they never met face to face. But in that process of reading each other and debating and understanding each other, they began to believe that they belong to one community. And also they began to believe that they could live together under one state, which now later on, when France became France and Germany became Germany, so the nation states were created. And you can see that here nation state is hyphenated, and what connects this nation, which is a community of people, and the state apparatus that we talk about. What connects these two entities is the language. So the hyphen there is actually, it actually is a metaphor, or it's a symbol of language, which is absent if you think of a colonial state or a monarchy or an empire. The state is not connected in the same way to the community, because there was no nation as such. So we also have other people who have talked about, I will not go into this. There are other factors which contributed to the emergence of national consciousness in the West, like Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther published 5 to 6 millions of Bibles in German. So therefore, again, reading publics were created, and Habermas talks about public sphere, which is the modern community that was created through the exchange of ideas through print media. Now, in India, what happened? Did we experience something like that? Is a question which historians never talk about. Now, for my own research, I looked at Telugu, for example, and I realized that from 1850 onwards, so many Telugu publishers, almost all Telugu scholars established printing presses. They bought and they made money. Some of them incurred losses. Irrespective of that, they continued to publish newspapers and journals, mostly journals. Newspapers came a little later. So in 1875, for example, there were more than 80 Telugu journals. Now, if you think today how many Telugu journals are available, hardly any come to my mind. So so the colonial intervention in Indian languages and literatures gave rise to this publishing industry, and it was very vibrant. So, that is something, if you want to think about in India nationalism, there is something that is completely erased from the nationalist histories, is about what happened. How do we understand Tamil nationalism, for example, or how do we understand something called Telugu nationalism or Malayali nationalism or Kannada nationalism? Because we often see them only as something that is undesirable, something that is negative in the presence of something called Indian nationalism. Because Indian nationalism sees these as a threat to its own existence, not as something integral to itself, right? So we'll come to that a little later. Now, I want to take you through a few more concepts about how do we think of ourselves? What is our role as people or as citizens in the nation? And what is the connection to language and citizens? Now, in a nation, people are sovereigns. Now, all of us know this, it's not big theory, but unfortunately, these concepts, even in higher education institutions, are not understood properly because they are not clearly taught at school level. But these ideally should be discussed, in maybe +2 level or even 10th class level. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen, and that is another reason why we have a poor education in India. Is again something that is related to the language policy that we have. I'll come to that again. So in monarchy, for example, people are not sovereigns; they are subjects. They don't have anything to contribute to for example, a policy matter or on an issue of public importance. Whereas in democracy, people are supposed to participate in the decision-making process, not just to enjoy the right to vote. Now, often in India, we think our job finishes after we vote to a particular party, and we think that for another 5 years, we have no role to play. Our representatives in parliament or in assembly, they will take decisions on their behalf. That's not how substantive democracy is supposed to work. So, in case, if we think that we as citizens have to participate in the democratic process, it's not automatic. Now we have to create conditions for that participation. So in public debates, if you want a public debate in India, in which language do we have is a question, right? Because public debates must happen in people's languages, not in the ruler's language or not in a classical language. So they must happen in people's language. So therefore, India as a nation, it's never-ending problem, because in which language do we have a debate? Can we have a debate, pan-Indian debate in a language, right? So therefore, you have all kinds of misconceptions that probably we should create one. Since we don't have one, we must create one. So then therefore, which language is better? Is it Hindi better, Urdu better, or Bengali better? Or so all kinds of questions come into being. Now, if you look at the Brexit issue in UK or the right to secession, that happened in Scotland, huge public debates happened. The decisions were not taken by the government itself. Now, before any decision was taken, of course, for both, referendum happened, and in India, referendum doesn't happen, right? We don't believe in referendums for anything, right? So whereas there you had huge public debates, and at the end of it there was a referendum. Now, when referendum is offered to people were already people were ready to make a decision, because they have gone through months and months of public debate, and everybody could understand. Right? Now, in India, for example, if you have the issue of Kashmir or the farm laws, now the public debate is often in the media, it happens in the English media, or most people write in the English media. I mean, of course, a lot of people do write in Indian languages, but if you think of a pan-Indian reading public, then that's possible only in English, because various literate, that to English literate people from all India write and read and understand each other. But it's almost impossible to for a Gujarati to understand what is the debate that is happening in Kerala or in Andhra in the vernacular media, right? Because we don't have that kind of a structure, right? Now, coming to the next one. Now, why I'm talking about, for example, these things is these are seen as very important for the realization of democratic values in any nation. Now, next I'm coming to the education being one of key things for the realization of citizenship or democracy in India, right? So now, but again here, for example, we often celebrate that India is a multilingual, multicultural nation, etc. But at the end of the day, when you ask people in what language do you want to offer education or in what language do you want to study, we choose English as the first one, right? Because it comes with its own benefits, etc. But also another important thing to understand here is that how we think about education and popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty being that that our own people as citizens, whether they have power to make decisions. That is what popular sovereignty means. It doesn't mean, it's not a very frightening phrase. But in India, we think of education as an instrument of state ideology, right? But not education as a means of popular sovereignty or equality or justice. Now, how does state ideology work? Now, state looks at a democratic state, a developmental state. Today looks at people as someone who has to be protected. State has to decide everything that is good for them, right? And how does state know about this? State knows about it through what it calls either the bureaucrats decide, the administrators decide, or professionals decide, or experts decide, right? So all that a state needs today is employ an army of experts in every field, and they will decide what is good for people. So that is how education is thought about in India. So therefore, people become consumers of knowledge, that we are taught what knowledge is all about, or we are taught science or social sciences or literature, etc. But we are never conscious of the fact that we also should be producing knowledge. That's not part of, by and large, in the Indian education system. Now, if you want to produce knowledge, if you think of people as sovereigns and people who can make decisions and produce knowledge, can we do that in India in English, where 90% of the population do not have access to English, right? Now, in the administration, I'm leaving that as a question. We'll come back to that a little later. Now, in administration, how does administration happen in India, which is also seen as very important as part of democracy, any democracy? Because we have civil services. So any district collector who passes the civil service, any person who passes the civil services from Gujarat can be posted in Telangana. And he or she may not know the local language. Now, the funny thing is, even in British India, district collectors were encouraged and were offered incentives by the British government for learning local languages, because they thought it's absurd to think of a district collector appointing a district collector who doesn't understand the language of that district. So looks like our situation is worse than a colonial situation, right? Because today it's taken for granted it's okay to have a district collector who doesn't understand the local language, right? Of course, you always have certain exceptions where district collectors take some interest on their own and learn a particular language. But that's not often the case. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the developmental state, this looks like irrelevant, because why do you have to talk to the people as an administrator? Because when you have already decided that you are going to just implement the state policies, there is no question of any negotiation with the people, right? Now, Partha Chatterjee talks about this Nehruvian developmental state, and he talks about this rationality of the developmental state. And he says, Nehru and his government decided that India should become a modern nation. And all that it requires is to set up modern institutions like big universities, big industries, technology hubs, etc. Now, for that, you need English. So English, therefore, was retained, right? So therefore, the idea of people's participation in democracy has been completely marginalized. Now, coming to the judiciary, can we have justice in a foreign language? I mean, it sounds so absurd. When I ask this question, maybe it sounds very absurd to many people, but that's the reality in India, right? Now, how was justice thought about in British India? Is an interesting thing to compare our own situation to the British situation again. If you think of the Madras presidency, the judges in the Madras state, there was one Madras state, right, which covered all the South India, most of the South India today. In Madras presidency, you had judges who were the British, so who spoke English. You had lawyers who spoke the local languages. You had the petitioners coming from all South Indian languages. So it was, and what was the law? The law, the legal texts were the Mohammedan law and Hindu law. They were the scriptures. So you need a lot of interpreters. This Venelkanti Subbarao, who left all his official communication with judges, lawyers, etc. behind, and now it's available as a small booklet. So if you look at that, then he explains what was the situation. It was a completely chaotic situation. It was a multilingual court, right? So the judges did not know what was the law. They depended on the priests and Maulvis to read those texts. And the lawyer often doesn't understand the language of the judge. The petitioners, of course, do not know what is going on in the court because they often come from a remote village, etc. Now, if you think of the same similar situation in an Indian court today, it's not very different, right? Now, if you go to a high court, you have judges. Often the chief justice doesn't know the local language because he is appointed from elsewhere. The lawyers can practice. Different lawyers from different states can come and practice here. So they often do not know the local language, right? Of course, the majority of the lawyers, you could say, are from the state, so they know. But at the same time, you have the demand everywhere, even from a police station. Now, people say, you write the petition in English because they don't want to do the translation. So they want the petitioner to get it translated. Now, at NALSAR University, I often have the lower strata of the staff here coming to me and requesting me, sir, can you draft a letter for me? I want to write this letter to the registrar, right? Now, similar situation happens here. Now, if people cannot have education in their language, if they cannot understand the language of the administration, if they can't make sense of what is going on in a court, now, can we call this democracy is a question, right? So therefore, Dr. Bini and the chair, Professor Ramanathan, do I have 5 minutes more?
Yeah, sure. We do have about 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. I was also thinking since there was one of the speakers was not there, maybe I could take 5 minutes more. Anyway, thank you for granting me the time. So I'll just briefly talk about the Andhra movement, which happened in 1913 onwards, and what they thought of the language question. Now, in order to understand what Andhra movement proposed in terms of language in India, we need to understand many more things. One is nationalism itself. Now, 1913 if you remember correctly, Gandhi wasn't part of the nationalist movement yet, because he enters the nationalist movement only in 1917 and more clearly in 18 onwards. So there was already, however, there was already this elitist conception of pan-India, one India as one nation. So you have Bipin Chandra Pal and Annie Besant, all of them were already part of the Congress party, and they were going around giving speeches. And so there was some imagination of India already, apart from the British Indian notion of India, which is much bigger than the present India, which includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Burma, etc., Sri Lanka. So that was the British Indian notion, right? Now, Andhra movement leaders said two things. And Pattab Sitaramaya, who later became one of the very important leaders of the Congress party, has written long essays in 1912-13 in English newspapers and of course in Telugu widely. And also another person who wrote about this is Konda Venkatapaya, and there are many, many others. So heated debates took place, for example, in the Hindu newspaper at the time. So there is some small collection of those available as a small book called For and Against Andhra. So if you look at those, they have made certain arguments about India. So they said, if you want democracy to function in India, if you want people to access justice and have fair education, then you cannot have India as one nation. You cannot have India as one homogeneous nation. Instead, all those would be possible if you create what they call a federation of linguistic nationalities. Now, the question is, how did these linguistic nationalities come into being? How did Andhra movement come into being? Now, no one has written a book like, for example, Benedict Anderson, who has written about this imagined community. Now, what we do need is to inquire and investigate and see what happened to linguistic communities and how did they emerge? How did Tamilians begin to think of themselves as a national community? And what happened to them? What were their aspirations? Why did they do all this big hangama of anti-Hindi agitation? So many people were killed, right? And what was the politics of the Andhra movement? Now, often, if you look at Indian nationalist histories, you get a very wrong picture of this. Now, often they are seen as secessionist, jingoistic, or divisive. These are parochial. These are the kinds of terms used to represent, to understand linguistic nationalisms in India. Whereas the Andhra movement was clearly saying, that separate Andhra movement, that in multilingual Madras presidency, thinking of justice is impossible. As for any one administration, it's impossible to know what people want. So you need to create this separate linguistic states where those states could make language policies on their own, create conditions for democracy, right? And of course, they were saying, this is possible only if you don't have a strong center. The center should be very weak and nationalities should be very strong, right? I'll come to that. So they were talking about the American model, for example, United States of taking from the American model, where you have separate constitutions and separate laws in separate states. So each state has a separate constitution and separate law, apart from the federal law, etc. I think the law people would know more about that than me, somebody who doesn't have much of a knowledge about that. So they were talking about something called United States of India, and they created a map of separate Andhra state. And they argued that democracy is feasible only in that structure. And they argued very strongly that if you create India as one homogeneous nation, it's going to be a disaster. And they also predicted, quite rightly, what we are witnessing today. So they said, if you create one homogeneous India with one strong center, you can expect Hindu majoritarianism to survive, to thrive, not just survive, to thrive. Because once you have this pan-Indian nation, the anxiety is, what is our identity? Right? What is Indian identity? Now, if you look at any textbooks or any history books or any sociology books, that dominant textbooks or the dominant scholarship, that you know that Indian identity is defined in terms of Hindu identity, nothing very different, right? It doesn't take the examples from other religions, for example. So therefore, for example, Etin Balibar talks about what Andhra movement had talked about in 1913, that linguistic identity is more inclusive, irrespective of caste, your religion. The fact that you identify yourself as a Tamilian or a Telugu, it's inclusive, right? So therefore, it is secular. And also, linguistic nationalism could put a full stop. If not put a complete full stop, it could limit the Hindu religious consciousness. Now, that is quite true. If you look at, for example, the South Indian states, BJP has not done well at all. In fact, in many states, they have got just 0 seats, parliament these are things which I think probably people get worried if I start talking about and using party names, etc. But I think one cannot but talk about these issues without making a reference to this. So, this idea of linguistic nationalities had a great appeal, for example, to the leftist intellectuals like E.M.S. Namboodiripad, etc. But after 1948, when India and Pakistan, when the partition happened, everyone was worried that probably, if you create or if you give into this idea, India might disintegrate into what they call the balkanization of India, that various parts, etc. Of course, the Andhra movement already said nothing of that sort they were proposing. They were proposing only a federation of linguistic nationalities with a central government, and where you have a 2-language policy. Every nationality can have its own language in every field, administration, judiciary, etc. And English can be a language of communication at the international level and also between the nationalities. And the center's existence would be decided by the nationalities, not the other way around. Today, we have the opposite situation where the existence of states depends on the center's mercy. So there are many things I think one could talk about, but I think I would end there. And maybe if there are questions, I could later on take up and answer. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Dr. Reddy. Thank you very much. That was a very detailed analysis. Well, it's a description, I guess, of linguistic impact on nationalism and how it's been seen through the ages and across the world. The last presentation for today will be by Nirma University's own Dr. Bini, and she's going to talk about where there is a will to right the wrongs. Is literature a way for effecting social change? Dr. Bini?
Yeah, this study originated from a rather idealistic notion I had about literature as a force for change and also a vehicle for justice. So these are very reassuring kind of ideas that many of us have when we are younger and greener in our idealism. Now, though the idealism has still survived, I'm striving to be less disillusioned by the intangibility of changes effected by literature and art. That is perhaps when we take refuge in theorizing. So As the rhetorical question in the title indicates, I'm trying to echo the proverb, where there is a will, there is a way, with an intent to review the idea of will. And the first name that would come to our mind is of Friedrich Nietzsche when he talks about will, and we will come to that later. But here I'm reconstituting the idea of will as an effect of the redistribution of the sensible. And it is a term that is from Rancière, and this idea of the redistribution of the sensible. We will explain that term as we proceed with the paper. And this term occurs in Rancière's discussion of dissensus in the context of democracy. You know, he uses this idea in many of his books, like Dissensus, Hatred of Democracy, Politics as Aesthetics, and many other texts that he has written. And this is this redistribution of the sensible is generated consciously or inadvertently. Let's start with the premise that the proverbial will that opens out new pathways of action straddles the ontological and the epistemological, the idea of the being, and also the idea of knowing. The being here is a self in whom knowing and doing converge and manifest. The paper inquires what generates the will for effecting change while inhabiting a social space and experiencing a life world, when you are already part of that whole phenomenon. How literature might be one of the forces constituting such a will or redistribution of the sensible is corollary to this analysis. Nietzsche's idea of will is entangled with notions of power, determination, concerted striving, and free expression of the self, as in free will. You know, the idea that he discusses elaborately in Thus Spake Zarathustra, and it can thus be interpreted as a force that can be channelized. Nietzsche agrees that the world and life worlds come to us through representations, filtered through and colored by diverse perceptions. The notion of will in Nietzsche is the driving force behind representations, as they attribute agentiality to the one who perceives and represents. So this is like a continuum, the being as the knower and the doer. And that is how I would like to kind of bring Nietzsche into the discourse. Even if we consider the fact that literature and art generate various kinds and levels of responses from people in and across time, there are pertinent examples of how literature and aesthetic expression have played a role in effecting social change. For social change, a redistribution of the sensible or a change in being, knowing, and doing is required, and literature could be instrumental in the redistribution of the sensible. So in common parlance, redistribution of the sensible could mean effecting a change in being, knowing, and doing, you know. And literature's role is not representation alone. When we analyze it against this framework, it unravels possibilities of emancipation and could also be a vehicle of subversive thinking. It can challenge and disrupt the existing hierarchies and reconceptualize the social order, making it more egalitarian. It is material to still ponder on whether literature shapes a society, represents it, or does both and beyond. The rich imaginings of literary texts have elicited such diverse responses in societies across the world that the function of literature cannot be explained away as representation, though representation is very much part of the whole scheme. Redistribution of the sensible is closely associated with the idea of radical equality that challenges a prejudiced epistemic division and hierarchization. In other words, the assumption that the deprived classes of people need an intellectual as a vanguard for their liberation through knowing and prompting them to do, things, that is to be questioned. And a similar argument can be found in Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Do we need an intellectual as the vanguard, for imparting the knowledge that would pave the way for transformation or social change? One may see extensive potential in aesthetic experiences from literature and arts, as they could be instrumental to a more egalitarian distribution of the sensible. So, intellect, or the idea of the sensible is not in the possession of a few, but there could be a more egalitarian redistribution of the sensible, and that is what that's what facilitates a more meaningful democracy. The idea of will should not be confused with normative notions about the writer's onus and accountability. So many a time the will is confused with intentionality, and hence it becomes a sort of accountability, it becomes synonymous with accountability. So that is quite illogical, because should one be blaming Friedrich Nietzsche for being an inspirational writer to the Nazis, who were believed to be motivated by the idea of the Overman in Thus Spake Zarathustra, the idea of the Übermenschen, Thus Spake Zarathustra? Is it proper to criticize Milton for intentionality or unintentionally depicting the persona of the Satan as so rebellious and enigmatic that one tends to be fascinated by his spirit of freedom and courage? And the text Paradise Lost has a stated intent. Ironically, the stated intent is Milton wanted to justify the ways of God to men. So please don't confuse this idea of will with a very simplistic notion of intentionality. We are not really talking about that here. And if will is to be understood along those lines, then this is how we tend to interpret literature, blaming a writer for the repercussions of his work in society, or the perceived consequences of his or her work in a society. Redistribution of the sensible is potentially subversive approach to representation and official versions of truth. The persecution and incarceration of writers and censorship that violates the right to expression are examples of annihilating and silencing voices that speak alternative versions of truth, which clamor over the official versions of truth. So one way of establishing this redistribution of the sensible is to find other kinds of truths which challenge the official versions of truth, and also having the courage to speak it out, having the courage to put it in the open. One may remember that many writers were exiled to Siberia for contradicting the official versions of truth in the erstwhile Soviet Union. There are several such examples. P.B. Shelley's expulsion from the Oxford University after the publication of The Necessity of Atheism. So irrespective of which authority that you challenge, speaking truth to power is often looked at with a kind of anxiety, and speaking truth to power is one way of redistributing the sensible. So there are plenty of examples from history. Nikos Kazantzakis, after the publication of The Last Temptation of Christ, which was banned. Then Milan Kundera's experience after having published The Joke. Then another example would be the execution of the Nigerian writer Kensaro Viva. Then Salman Rushdie banning of the satanic verses. So all these could be considered as that anxiety power has about alternative versions of truth, or truth that contradicts the official versions of truth. The widespread intolerance to ideas, subtle and absolute control over production and distribution of art and literature, and tactics of annihilation and intimidation of artists and writers would be in a way injurious to any democratic process. Freedom of thought and expression and a democratic distribution of knowledge reinforce a redistribution of the sensible. Literature is a potential site of parrhesia, which is fearless speech or the act of speaking truth to power. Parrhesia abstracts other invisibilized, something that is made invisible, something that is silenced, possibilities of truth from the singular and rigid official versions of historical truth. There are several modes through which literary texts operate as sites of parrhesia. To give an example from history, India has seen a period in its history wherein freedom of expression and other rights assured by democracy were grievously undermined. Literary texts from several regional languages captured the sheer horror of these days. One may remember the scathing satire on the period of emergency in O.V. Vijayan, who's a Malayalam writer. O.V. Vijayan's Dharma Puranam, originally written in Malayalam and translated into English by the author as the Saga of Dharmapura. Through an allegory of the Prajapati, who literally makes his people eat his shit, is a regime where patriotism is measured in terms of the rise of the ruler's tricolor, like the Indian flag, underwear, peaking in arrogant megalomania. Vijayan portrays the time of unfreedom, dictatorship, that conflated the boundaries between the ruler and the nation and servitude in a country labeled democratic. So the resonances of this portrayal of autocracy seems relevant in and across time and space, even now. Several novels and plays give diverse versions of Indian emergency through indirect, allegorical, and satirical means. Such accounts reconstitute history in a more nuanced, inclusive manner in comparison to the one-dimensional, exclusive, authoritarian official version. Exclusive because it can be accessed by only a few. And it excludes many narrative. It includes one particular stream of narrative, and it's accessible to an exclusive number of people. The indirection used by Jean-Paul Sartre to surreptitiously bring out the injustice and brutality of the Vichy regime and German domination in Paris was to write a series of plays on Greek mythology. So it's a very clever way of reaching directions through indirections. When you can't really write directly about something, you use a strategy to mask it. So through indirections, you reach that direction that is exemplified by this work, Jean-Paul Sartre's works based on Greek mythology. The Unfamiliar Life World in Flies, which is a play by Jean-Paul Sartre, made the French minds feel the allegorical pulse in their times, while the government could not see through the trick. Though he was part of the resistance movement, Sartre could not have directly attacked the Nazis, as he knew he would be silenced and even terminated. His anti-fascist views conveyed through his plays were not noticed by the censorship lobbies, but people understood the message. In Flies, Aegisthus allegorically represents the Nazi German occupation and Clytemnestra the collaborating devious Vichy government. The tragedy of Argos is an analogy to the Nazi occupation of Paris, a lingering pestilence imposed by forces from outside, a metaphor used also by Albert Camus in his novel The Plague, the pestilence that has affected the space, the country. Through such powerful metaphors and allegories, these writers exercise parrhesia, and they also become instrumental in a redistribution of the sensible. Another example could be Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Cancer Ward, which uses the metaphor of throat cancer, making one speechless, to present a powerful critique against totalitarianism's destruction of the freedom of speech. Parrhesia liberates the writer from the shackles of intellectual subordination. When we look at representation or interpretation through the lens of power knowledge, the importance of text in capturing the invisibilized and silenced lives and voices of people become all the more significant. In understanding subalternity in terms of race, caste, and gender, such alternative subtexts are of considerable relevance. The problem you may feel in my analysis so far is the projection of literature as a vehicle of ideology or an ally in the battles of ideologies and truths. We are yet to find answers to the questions concerning the aesthetic aspect of literature and how well it connects with the ideological representations. I mean, I cannot agree with an elementalist division between engagement with ideas and aesthetic enjoyment. As such, I don't feel that we should look at these as two different categories. Artists and writers feel the pressure to intervene in such a way that their artistic or literary endeavor fulfills a political function. It can happen inadvertently as well. And enthusiasm to this end may turn art into a form of reportage or propaganda. Now, one may distance from the simplistic notions of social realism that an artist should be socially committed and her creative expression is a manifestation of that commitment which contributes to political struggles. That is a very inane way of looking at such expressions. It's not about art causing social revolution. Its indifference is the drive for social revolution. I will exemplify, or I will illustrate this by explaining a movement which was initiated in France, and this is very beautifully captured in a work of Ramanathan. Through a redistribution of the sensible by challenging the ossified boundaries of the sensible, art is capable of identifying with both the conscious and unconscious in society. Emancipation entails creating a new body and new life force, and one of the means to this end could be a reappropriation of literary genres, writing, theatre, publication, and poetry societies. Such activities help one lead a less alienated and more fulfilling life. In Knights of Labor, the workers' dream in 19th century France, an analysis of the aesthetic aspirations of the working class during the July Revolution in France in 1830, Ramanathan shows how the night becomes a site of protest as these workers refuse to rest and sleep. When they rest and sleep, they are indirectly preparing themselves for labor the next day. So that is what is designated to them as an occupation. So they try to transcend the barriers of class by reading late into the night, discussing poetry, indulging in theatrical activities, and that is how they challenge the status quo, not doing what is expected of them to do, and also appropriating a domain that was conventionally attributed to the intellectuals, the intellectual vanguard. Resting and sleeping would rejuvenate them for more toil and routine factory work, but the workers stayed awake, writing poetry and philosophizing into the early hours of the day. The individual aspirations of the worker generate a form of agency which invigorates collective action, counters systemic and epistemic violence of the state, and facilitates structural change. So this is a deeper structural and systemic change, when you transcend the boundaries attributed to you by your class, your caste, or your gender, and then you do things that nobody expects you to do, and then nobody forces you to do that. You take it upon yourself. Workers' entry into the spaces of poetry and philosophy and processes of emancipation engendered by the discovery of such spaces are signs of a democratic aspiration and excitement. And these are forces that slowly takes a democracy to the redistribution of the sensible. By writing about life worlds, people turned their own lives into objects of art. Such ontological aesthetic engagements are more powerful than a rebellion in challenging the status quo. In this context, the observation of William Edward Dubois about the role of aesthetics in everyday lives and attitudes in countering another hierarchical classification, race, could be remembered. To quote Dubois, I apologize on his behalf because he uses the term Negro, but let me read the quotation. I quote, "The immediate problem of the Negro was the question of securing existence, of labor and income, of food and home, of spiritual independence and democratic control of the industrial processes. It would not do to concentrate all effort on economic well-being and forget freedom and equality. Rather, this is important, and that phrase at the end, rather, Negroes must live and eat and strive, and still hold unfaltering commerce with the stars." So that power of imaginative exercises, that empowering effect of imagination or fantasizing, still holding commerce with the stars. It's not enough to get the black people food on their plate or giving them access to good education or healthcare, but they must enlighten themselves in such a way that they can still hold an unfaltering communication with the stars. Dubois suggests that for the blacks to escape from the grim and mundane realities of their existence, it's important to have collective or solitary endeavors leading to knowledge and aesthetic engagements. The workers or the poor need not feel dependent for their aesthetic or intellectual emancipation on those who are deemed to be intellectuals, artistic and artists and the knowledgeable people. So it's, even if an intellectual functions in a sort of organicity, that is not enough, So if the intellectual is still an outsider who's trying to make a space in the inside of the life world of the workers or the deprived, When one sees art and literature as a redistribution of the sensible, its radical potential emerges. The emancipatory potential of art, writing, and performance is an aesthetic constituted by dissensus and practice of equality. So equality is not a given. Equality is something that has to be performed. Equality is something that needs you to break into other people's life world and then, doing things that would subvert the idea of the status quo. Status quo in terms of gender, class, caste, and all these hierarchical social divisions. Art and literature that aim to emancipate its spectator and reader often presumes that the spectator is passive and ignorant, and that is what the redistribution of the sensible challenges. Aesthetics is not about the artist transmitting superior ideas and sensibilities to the masses for uplifting them. The emancipated spectator is an active interpreter and co-creator of art. While people make poetry, poetry in turn makes people. When people do art and literature, aesthetic regimes which restrict the distribution of the sensible open out to people, stimulating a more democratic politics. The rulers gain absolute command over people by keeping them ignorant or by generating and circulating false knowledge, the idea of the false consciousness or the official versions of truth, validating the authoritarian regulations being imposed on them. To give an example, in Oceania, the totalitarian state in Orwell's novel 1984, control is exercised not only through surveillance and fear tactics, but the absolute control is in fact exercised through meticulous circulation of a mental habit of gullibility, a new language, newspeak, and a mode of thinking resulting from it. So it is through epistemic processes that sometimes you accomplish absolute control, and then there could be an epistemic challenge to that sort of epistemic subordination. Redistribution of the sensible generated through literature wakes the oppressed from the slumber of inertia to the dawn of analytical thinking and informed consciousness. The danger of a culture of silence thriving among the destitute and dispossessed masses cannot be underestimated. It's still very much there. And that is how aesthetics as education helps one unlearn the language of silence and slavishness and rediscover the voice of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really erudite. And I think this panel has been a very fitting conclusion to 2 days of great discussion and new ideas being brought to the table and new ways of looking at language and literature in terms of law and where that might move the program and the new course and the new way of looking at this. So does anybody have any questions, any comments? Do the panelists have any comments for each other? Okay, I think we're kind of getting close to the valedictory ceremony. So I'm going to close it now so that everybody has a chance to go get a drink of water before we all come back. Thank you. Thank you very much to Nirma University and Dr. Bini and Dr. Purvi for setting this up and inviting us all to this.
We don't have a...
It's been very energizing. Sorry, you were saying?
No, we don't have a formal valedictory session now because Dr. Purvi had to leave. She has to attend a meeting, and then she has given the responsibility of formally expressing our gratitude to all of you. Without all of you, it couldn't have been possible. So we all had a wonderful experience interacting with all of you, and I hope you will contribute to our project, law, language, literature in many different ways, intellectually and through your practical inputs. And we will also keep you posted. We promise to keep you posted. And we are planning to bring out a journal, a publication, and we will trouble you for papers, contributions to that publication. So I thank Nirma University for giving us the opportunity. And this whole project was the outcome of a discussion that we had with Professor Purvi Pokhriyal. So it's in a way her brainchild. So we thank her in absentia. Then Kunal and Kushal for their support. And then I must thank Nainika Singhal. She was our student coordinator, and then she was throughout this journey. And without the support of the students, we couldn't have done this conference. So even though they were not on the campus, they supported us in all possible ways. And that was really the driving force behind this conference. Their enthusiasm sometimes, reassured us in moments of doubt and anxiety. So I thank the students and all the participants, especially the participants in this session, Dr. Reddy, Dr. Suneetha Rani, Dr. Desai, and Dr. Lajwanti, who is very much part of the Nirma family, but she couldn't join us today because of ill health, and also the other participants who contributed to this conference. Thank you very much. Thank you. Kushal and Kunal, would you like to add something? Is Nainika present in the meeting? Yeah, we will organize many such colloquia and conferences, because this is going to be a very long project. So we are looking forward to all kinds of interventions from you.